On the humid night of August 8, 2009, in the quiet town of Orlando, Florida, the streets lay still under the glow of orange street lamps. Inside a modest two-story home on Cedar Pine Lane, a nightmare was unfolding that would soon capture national headlines. The perpetrator was not a masked intruder or an armed gang member. It was 32-year-old Tiffany Cole, a woman whose outward charm and friendly smile had convinced neighbors she was the picture of Southern hospitality. The victims, James and Carol Sumner, were a retired couple in their 60s who had once treated Tiffany like family. Years earlier, when Tiffany's own life was in turmoil, the Sumners had taken her in, offering her a place to stay, meals at their table, and advice on how to get back on her feet. They saw potential in her, a young woman who had simply made a few wrong choices. But gratitude was not the legacy Tiffany would leave behind. By mid-2009, Tiffany had fallen deep into financial trouble, entangled with a controlling boyfriend, and obsessed with the idea of easy money. The Sumners had recently sold their home for a large sum, and Tiffany knew exactly where they banked and roughly how much they had. It was enough to ignite a plan that would cross every moral boundary. But what drives a woman to destroy the very people who once saved her? How does kindness become a death sentence? On the evening of the crime, Tiffany and her boyfriend, along with two male accomplices, invited the Sumners out under the guise of a friendly visit. The elderly couple, trusting as ever, opened their home without hesitation. Within minutes, that trust was shattered. The men brandished firearms, forcing James and Carol to the floor while Tiffany watched, her face unreadable. The couple was bound with duct tape, their mouths gagged to stifle cries for help. Rather than end the ordeal quickly, Tiffany's crew drove the Sumners in their own Lincoln Town car to a remote wooded area just outside Jacksonville. The destination, a shallow grave that Tiffany and her boyfriend had prepared days earlier. The Sumners were still alive when they were lowered into the earth. Covered in dirt, their last breaths were taken in darkness, suffocated under the weight of soil and betrayal. Afterward, Tiffany and her partners drained the couple's bank accounts, withdrawing thousands over the next few days. They used the stolen money for hotel stays, luxury purchases, and drugs, acting as though nothing unusual had happened. Tiffany even smiled in surveillance footage from an ATM, the glow of the machine reflecting in her eyes as she entered James Sumner's PIN. Investigators pieced together the crime with chilling speed. Surveillance videos, bank withdrawal records, and Tiffany's own cell phone data placed her at key locations before, during, and after the murders. Witness testimony revealed she had openly discussed robbing the Sumners and disposing of them so they couldn't talk. When police finally arrested Tiffany, she showed little emotion. In interrogation, she alternated between denial and cold rationalization. She claimed she didn't think they'd die so fast, and that it was mostly her boyfriend's idea, yet the evidence of her planning was overwhelming. Detectives noted her lack of genuine remorse and the calculated way she had executed every stage of the crime. The trial became a media spectacle. Prosecutors painted Tiffany as the mastermind, the one who knew the victims, who initiated the betrayal, and who ensured their permanent silence. The defense attempted to shift blame onto the male accomplices, suggesting Tiffany had been manipulated and intimidated. But the jury wasn't convinced. The combination of her prior relationship with the victims and the cruelty of burying them alive sealed her fate. On March 6, 2010, Tiffany Cole was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. She was sentenced to death, making her one of the youngest women on death row in the United States. Appeals followed, as is common in capital cases, but each upheld the original verdict. The Florida Supreme Court described her actions as cold, calculated, and premeditated, carried out with a level of betrayal that magnifies the brutality of the crime. Even behind bars, Tiffany's story continued to fascinate and horrify. True crime documentaries featured her case as an example of female predators, while prison interviews revealed a woman who still spoke more about her own hardships than about the agony of the Sumners' final moments. For many, the question lingers: was Tiffany Cole a victim of her own poor choices, pulled into darkness by toxic relationships? Or was she always capable of the kind of cruelty that leaves no room for redemption? The graves of James and Carol Sumner remain in a small Florida cemetery, tended by relatives and community members who refuse to let them be forgotten. Their story is a reminder that evil does not always wear a stranger's face. Sometimes it smiles at you from across the dinner table. But as chilling as Tiffany's betrayal was, our next case ventures into a different kind of darkness. One where a young woman turned her ambition into a weapon, eliminating anyone who threatened her rise. On the crisp autumn morning of October 13, 1995, in the bustling city of Charlotte, North Carolina, Police responded to a frantic 911 call from a modest brick home in the suburbs. Inside, they discovered the lifeless body of 25-year-old Tyrecia Andrews, a vibrant young woman known in her community for her ambition and drive. Standing just feet away, feigning shock and grief, was her closest friend, 23-year-old Patricia Blackman. To neighbors and co-workers, Patricia had been a model of perseverance. She'd risen from a troubled childhood to hold a steady job and was often seen mentoring local teens. But beneath that respectable exterior was a simmering resentment and a hunger for control that would erupt into one of the most disturbing domestic homicide cases in the state's history. The two women had met years earlier and developed a bond built on shared struggles and mutual support. Tyrecia trusted Patricia enough to let her move into her home temporarily while she sorted through financial troubles. But trust can be a dangerous currency, and Patricia was already spending it recklessly. By early October, Tyrecia had received word of a major promotion at work, one Patricia had quietly coveted for herself. The promotion promised not only a significant salary increase but also the kind of social recognition Patricia craved. Friends would later testify that Patricia's mood shifted dramatically after the news, her compliments toward Tyrecia laced with bitterness. But what drives someone to turn envy into violence? How does a friend transform into an executioner? In the days leading up to the murder, Patricia began subtly isolating Tyrecia from mutual friends, intercepting her phone calls and monitoring her schedule. On the night of October 12th, Patricia made her move. She prepared the house for what she chillingly referred to in a later jailhouse conversation as the reckoning. Investigators would later piece together the sequence. Sometime after midnight, Patricia confronted Tyrecia in the living room. An argument erupted, escalating rapidly from words to blows. Tyrecia, caught off guard, tried to flee toward the front door, but Patricia was already armed with a heavy brass candlestick, a family heirloom taken from the mantel. The first blow struck Tyrecia on the temple, knocking her to the floor. What followed was a sustained, merciless attack that left the victim with multiple skull fractures, defensive wounds on her arms, and deep lacerations across her scalp. The brutality did not end there. Forensic evidence revealed that Patricia paused between strikes, possibly to taunt her victim, before delivering the final, fatal blow. Blood spatter analysis indicated she had stood over Tyrecia, ensuring the injuries were lethal. After the murder, Patricia staged the scene to suggest a break-in. She scattered papers, knocked over furniture, and left a back window partially open. She even took the time to make the 911 call herself, her voice trembling convincingly as she reported finding her friend already gone. But detectives were quick to notice inconsistencies. There were no signs of forced entry and valuables remained untouched. Tyrecia's purse, jewelry, and electronics were all in plain sight. More damningly, a neighbor reported hearing shouting and heavy thuds just after midnight, followed by the sound of running water, likely as Patricia cleaned herself up before calling for help. The turning point came when investigators discovered Patricia's diary. In it, she'd written about her resentment toward Tyrecia's success and her belief that people only rise when others are removed from the way. Chillingly, she described scenarios of taking back control and removing obstacles, language that matched the brutal reality of the crime. During interrogation, Patricia alternated between denial and self-pity. She painted herself as a victim of circumstance, claiming she had been under immense stress and had snapped. But forensic evidence, including blood on her clothing and the absence of any intruder DNA, made her story unravel. The trial, held in early 1996, drew large crowds and heavy media coverage. The prosecution framed Patricia as a woman driven by jealousy and entitlement, willing to destroy the very person who had extended her kindness. They emphasized the calculated nature of her actions, the preparation, the staging, and the controlled delivery of the fatal blows. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, citing her difficult upbringing and recent financial struggles, but the jury remained unmoved. After just 5 hours of deliberation, Patricia Blackman was found guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in his closing remarks, called it a crime born not of desperation, but of deliberate malice. In prison, Patricia maintained her innocence publicly, though other inmates reported she often boasted about showing people their place, and referred to herself as the last person you want to cross. She has filed multiple appeals, none successful. For Tyrecia's family, the pain remains raw. Her mother has spoken at victim advocacy events, warning about the danger signs of jealousy in friendships and urging others to take subtle hostility seriously. The case has since been studied in criminal psychology courses as an example of intimate betrayal homicide, where the emotional connection between killer and victim intensifies the violence. The brass candlestick, cleaned and sealed in evidence storage, remains a silent reminder of a night when friendship curdled into lethal envy. It stands as a testament to how ambition, when poisoned by resentment, can lead to irreversible acts. But as twisted as Patricia's motives were, our next case takes us into a realm where greed alone was enough to sign a death warrant, and the killer's charm was as dangerous as any weapon she carried. On the warm spring afternoon of May 17, 2003, in the small community of Lithonia, Georgia, 44-year-old business owner Charles Hampton was found dead in his own living room, slumped over in an armchair. His neck bore deep ligature marks, his watch was missing, and his safe, bolted to the floor, had been cleaned out. Within hours, suspicion began to swirl not around strangers or business rivals, but around the woman who had been closest to him in both life and trust, Shonda Johnson, a 29-year-old known for her magnetic personality and sharp business sense. To outsiders, Shonda appeared to be living the dream. She was stylish, quick-witted, and often the center of attention at local gatherings. Charles, a respected entrepreneur who ran a small fleet of delivery trucks, had met her through mutual friends. The chemistry had been instant, and within months she had moved into his home, convincing him they could build a life together. Friends noticed how quickly she integrated herself into his finances, helping with bank deposits, managing invoices, even holding spare keys to his office. But what drives a woman to turn romance into a financial death trap? How does love become a stepping stone to murder? By early 2003, Shonda's spending habits had grown extravagant. She frequented high-end boutiques, purchased a new luxury car, and was rumored to be planning a vacation overseas. Her income couldn't sustain the lifestyle, but Charles's could, and she knew it. Investigators would later learn that she'd been pressuring Charles to add her name to his accounts, change his life insurance policy, and grant her legal access to his assets. When he hesitated, citing the need to take things slow, Shonda's patience ran out. In the weeks before the murder, she quietly contacted two men from her past, acquaintances with criminal records, and offered them a cut of Charles's cash and valuables in exchange for helping her solve a problem. Witness testimony later revealed she framed it as a quick, easy job, with no loose ends. The men, enticed by the promise of fast money, agreed. On the day of the crime, Charles returned home after a long morning overseeing deliveries. He poured himself a drink and settled into the living room. Shonda arrived shortly after, accompanied by her two hired accomplices, under the guise of bringing him lunch. As Charles greeted her, one man stepped behind him, looping a length of electrical cord around his neck. The second man restrained him as Shonda watched, her face unreadable. Charles fought, knocking over the glass table in front of him, but the cord tightened until his body went limp. Rather than panic, Shonda immediately began directing the next phase. She ordered the men to carry Charles's body to the armchair, arranging him to appear as though he had fallen asleep. She retrieved the keys to his office safe from his pocket and oversaw the removal of cash, documents, and several pieces of expensive jewelry. The watch on his wrist, a gift from his late father, was the last item taken before they left. When Charles failed to show up for a scheduled dinner with his sister that evening, she went to the house and found him motionless. The scene, though staged, felt wrong. A faint smell of sweat and metal in the air, a toppled table no one had cleaned up. Police were called, and the initial thought of a natural death quickly shifted to homicide after medical examiners confirmed ligature strangulation. Detectives began piecing together the hours before Charles's death. Bank records showed large cash withdrawals from his accounts in the days after, all traced back to ATMs near Shonda's favorite boutiques. Surveillance footage captured her smiling as she carried shopping bags, sometimes with one of the hired men at her side. When questioned, Shonda feigned grief, claiming Charles had been like a husband to her. She insisted she knew nothing about the safe's contents, yet inconsistencies piled up. The electrical cord used in the killing matched a spool found in her garage. One accomplice, arrested on unrelated charges, eventually confessed, implicating Shonda as the mastermind. He claimed she had promised each man $5,000 but paid them only a fraction, keeping the rest for herself. The trial in 2004 painted Shonda as a manipulative predator who had used her beauty and charm to disarm Charles, gaining his trust while plotting his demise. Prosecutors emphasized the betrayal, the calculated choice to kill someone who had opened his home and heart to her. They introduced evidence of her lavish post-murder spending spree and testimony from friends who recalled her saying she wouldn't wait around for a man to give her what she deserved. The defense argued Shonda was caught up in a bad crowd and had no direct role in the killing. They claimed the accomplices acted independently, pinning the blame on her to reduce their own sentences. But the jury, presented with a timeline, financial motive, and the damning testimony of her co-conspirator, found her guilty of first-degree murder, armed robbery, and conspiracy. Shonda Johnson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The accomplices received lesser sentences in exchange for cooperation, but both remain incarcerated. In post-trial interviews, jurors cited the cold arithmetic of her actions as the deciding factor. One juror put it bluntly, she calculated every step and Charles's life was just another transaction. From behind bars, Shonda has given occasional interviews, portraying herself as a misunderstood woman trapped by circumstance. Yet even in those conversations, her focus drifts toward her own hardships, rarely acknowledging the man whose life she helped end. Charles Hampton's family has kept his memory alive through community scholarships and an annual memorial run. His sister, who found his body that night, still visits the house on Cedar Pine Lane, now owned by another family. "I can forgive," she once said, "but I can't forget that someone he trusted most signed his death warrant." And while Shonda's crime was rooted in greed, our next case reveals an even darker edge, where the motive wasn't money or ambition, but the intoxicating thrill of killing itself. On the night of June 14, 2011, the city of Detroit, Michigan, was buzzing with the sounds of summer. Music spilling from open car windows, laughter from front porches, and the hum of late-night traffic. But on a dimly lit street in the East Side, 21-year-old nursing student Alicia Bennett's life was about to be cut short in an act so senseless that even veteran homicide detectives struggled to explain it. The perpetrator was Candace C. Thompson, a 24-year-old whose childhood had been a patchwork of foster homes, juvenile detention stints, and minor arrests. She was known in her neighborhood as tough, unpredictable, and dangerously impulsive. Friends described her as someone who craved excitement, the kind of person who would start a fight just to feel her adrenaline spike. In the weeks leading up to that June night, Candace had been restless. She complained to friends that life was boring and that she wanted to do something big, something people would remember her for. There was no mention of money, revenge, or jealousy. For her, the thrill itself was the reward. But what drives a person to kill for no reason beyond the rush? How does the absence of motive make the crime even more terrifying? On June 14th, Candace and two acquaintances spent the evening drinking cheap liquor in a friend's basement, talking about nothing in particular until the conversation turned dark. According to later testimony, Candace suggested they go find someone to mess with. When one of the men laughed and asked, "Like rob them?" Candace's reply was chilling. "No. Like end them." Shortly after midnight, they piled into a beat-up sedan and began cruising through residential streets. Alicia Bennett was walking home from a late shift at the hospital, wearing scrubs and carrying a small shoulder bag. She had less than 2 blocks to go when Candace spotted her. "She'll do," Candace reportedly said. They stopped the car, and Candace approached Alicia under the pretense of asking for the time. Before Alicia could answer, Candace pulled a folding knife from her pocket and lunged. The first stab pierced Alicia's side, the second, aimed higher, struck her chest. Alicia screamed and tried to run, but Candace grabbed her hair, dragging her toward a nearby alley. What happened next was fast and brutal. Alicia sustained over a dozen stab wounds in less than a minute. Neighbors later told police they heard muffled cries but assumed it was a couple arguing. By the time one man stepped outside to investigate, Candace and her accomplices were gone, leaving Alicia collapsed against a chain-link fence. She was still alive when paramedics arrived but died en route to the hospital. Investigators quickly realized the randomness of the crime made it even harder to solve. Alicia had no known enemies, no signs of robbery, her bag, phone, and cash were untouched. For several days the case stalled. Then a break came from an unlikely source, Candace herself. Bragging in a text to a friend, she described the killing in detail, even mentioning the victim's scrubs and the look in her eyes as she fell. That friend, disturbed by the message, contacted police anonymously. Detectives traced the phone number back to Candace and brought her in for questioning. At first, she denied everything, smirking through most of the interview. But when confronted with cell tower data placing her near the crime scene, she admitted to being there, but claimed someone else did the stabbing. Her accomplices told a different story. Both men said Candace had initiated the attack without warning and that they were too shocked to intervene. One recalled her laughing as they drove away, saying, "Did you see her face? That was priceless." During the trial in 2012, prosecutors painted Candace as a predator who killed for the pure thrill of it. They introduced her text messages, witness testimony, and the knife, recovered from a storm drain near her apartment, with Alicia's blood on the blade. The defense tried to argue diminished capacity, citing her history of childhood trauma, but psychiatric evaluations found her competent and fully aware of her actions. The jury deliberated for just over 3 hours before finding Candace Thompson guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The judge, visibly shaken, told her, "This was not a crime of passion nor of gain, it was a crime of emptiness. And that emptiness makes it all the more dangerous." Inside prison, Candace has maintained an unsettling lack of remorse. Guards have reported her making flippant comments about the murder to other inmates, and she has been disciplined multiple times for violent altercations. In a rare interview, she dismissed the killing as one night out of a lot of nights, and claimed she didn't dwell on the past. For Alicia's family, the senselessness of the crime has been the hardest part to bear. Her mother has spoken publicly about the randomness of the attack, saying, "There was nothing my daughter could have done differently. She just walked into the wrong street at the wrong time, and into the path of someone who wanted to kill." Alicia's former co-workers at the hospital established a scholarship in her name for nursing students, ensuring her dedication to helping others would outlive the night her own life was taken. And yet, even in the grim world of homicide, Candace's case stands apart. It wasn't about power, money, or even anger, it was about the intoxicating high of taking a life. That absence of reason leaves a chilling truth. If someone can kill without motive, they can kill anyone. As disturbing as that is, our next case moves into another dimension of horror, where the victim wasn't a stranger or even a friend, but a member of the killer's own family, and the betrayal cut far deeper than any blade ever could. On the icy morning of January 22, 2015, in the small town of Gary, Indiana, neighbors were jolted awake by the sight of police cruisers lining Maple Avenue. Inside a modest single-story home, officers discovered the body of 58-year-old Martha Reynolds sprawled across her kitchen floor. There were no signs of forced entry, no valuables missing, and no evidence of a break-in. The killer had walked in through the front door, and she had been invited. The suspect was Danielle Reynolds, Martha's 28-year-old niece. Known to family members as a once bright young woman with a quick smile, Danielle had grown distant in recent years. After dropping out of college, she bounced between jobs, often relying on relatives for financial help. Martha had been one of her most consistent supporters, paying overdue bills, buying groceries, and even co-signing a loan for Danielle's used car. But what transforms gratitude into lethal greed? How does a family's helping hand become the victim's undoing? In the weeks before the murder, Danielle had been facing eviction from her apartment. Her car had been repossessed after missed payments, and friends said she often complained about being done asking for help. Investigators would later uncover a series of internet searches on her phone: "How to Kill Someone Quietly," "Poisons You Can Find at Home," and "Inheritance Laws in Indiana." On the night of January 21st, Danielle texted Martha asking if she could come by in the morning to talk about a personal matter. Martha, as always, agreed. Just after 8 a.m., Danielle arrived carrying a small tote bag. The two women sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee. What happened next was pieced together through forensic evidence and Danielle's eventual confession. Danielle waited until Martha turned to rinse her mug at the sink. She retrieved a length of rope from her bag and looped it around Martha's neck, pulling back with sudden force. The struggle was short but violent. Martha managed to knock over a chair and scratch Danielle's forearm before collapsing to the floor. Rather than flee, Danielle spent the next 20 minutes wiping down surfaces, removing her fingerprints from cabinet handles and light switches. She opened the back door to make it appear as though someone had fled that way, then locked it again from the inside, a mistake detectives would later note immediately. By mid-morning, Danielle had returned to her apartment. At 2 p.m., she called Martha's phone, letting it ring several times before leaving a voicemail asking her to call back when you get a chance. This attempt to establish an alibi unraveled when neighbors reported seeing Danielle's car in Martha's driveway that morning. One even noted she had been carrying a tote bag when she arrived and left without it. Inside the tote bag, later recovered from a dumpster behind Danielle's building, police found the rope, a pair of latex gloves, and an envelope containing Martha's checkbook. Handwriting analysis confirmed Danielle had already written herself a check for $5,000, dated for later that week. The most damning evidence came from bank security footage. Just hours after the murder, Danielle was caught on camera trying to withdraw $800 from Martha's account using her ATM card. She entered the wrong PIN twice, then left the bank visibly agitated. When detectives brought Danielle in for questioning, she initially claimed she hadn't seen her aunt in weeks. But confronted with surveillance images and witness statements, her story shifted. She admitted visiting Martha that morning but insisted she left while she was alive and well. Finally, after nearly 6 hours of interrogation, Danielle broke down and confessed. Though even in her admission she portrayed herself as a victim of circumstance. "I just couldn't keep asking her for money," she said, "and I knew she had more than she needed." The trial, held in late 2015, drew intense attention in the local press. Prosecutors emphasized the premeditation, the internet searches, the rope in the tote bag, and the staged crime scene. They described Danielle as a woman who saw her aunt not as family but as a financial obstacle to be removed. The defense argued she had acted in a moment of desperation, without fully intending to kill, but forensic testimony about the sustained force required for the strangulation undercut that claim. Jurors took less than a day to convict Danielle Reynolds of first-degree murder and attempted theft. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in his remarks, noted the particularly callous and calculated nature of killing someone who had repeatedly come to her aid. In prison, Danielle has maintained sporadic contact with distant relatives, though most of her family has cut ties completely. Martha's younger sister has spoken publicly about the case, saying, "It's one thing to lose someone to violence, it's another to know it came from within your own bloodline." The house where Martha was killed was eventually sold, but neighbors say the memory of that morning still lingers. For them, the betrayal wasn't just in the act itself, but in the knowledge that trust had been weaponized against someone who gave so freely. And while Danielle's crime was rooted in greed disguised as desperation, our next case takes us to the opposite end of the spectrum, a killing fueled not by money, but by a burning desire for revenge, carried out with meticulous patience and a plan years in the making.